You may remember that not long after his election, Pope Francis did a series of kind of blockbuster media interviews that made the round of the world. The first one of them actually came on the return flight from Brazil. It was the 28th of July, 2013. I was on that plane as part of the Vatican Press Corps, and I guarantee you we had no idea this was coming. The Pope simply came back to the press compartment on the way back and stood in the front and said, "Okay, what do you got?" No filters, no taboos, no script, no choreography, totally, off the cuff. We could ask him any question under the sun. I tell you, folks, when you cover the Vatican, you sometimes lie awake at night dreaming of moments like this, but you never actually think you're going to see them, okay? But there we were. My soundbite for all this is that that flight, which was Alitalia Flight 4001 from Rio de Janeiro to Rome, in many ways, it was nothing to write home about. The food was awful. The seats were uncomfortable. I will give it this. The in-flight entertainment was spectacular. Okay? So on that occasion and a few other occasions, the Holy Father made some version of the following comment. He said, "I don't think it is necessary for me to talk all the time about things like abortion and homosexuality and contraception because the teaching of the Church on these points is already well known." And I think in some quarters there was some concern that that meant that the Holy Father was somehow backing away from the Church's defense of the gospel of life, or sort of throwing in the white towel in the culture wars. Ladies and gentlemen, take it from me, nothing could be further from the truth. This is a robustly pro-life Pope. Now, I could illustrate that to you in a variety of different ways, but let me just give you one. This past August, when the Holy Father went to South Korea, he made one impromptu addition to his schedule while he was there, and it was a personal choice by him. No one foisted this upon him. It was his own initiative. He learned that there was a memorial to the victims of abortion, a kind of cemetery for abortion victims, behind a Catholic social service center he was going to be visiting outside Seoul. It's a very evocative spot. It's a kind of grassy hill that is dotted with white crosses to represent the victims of abortion. South Korea actually has one of the highest abortion rates in the world. And all of this is under a statue of the Holy Family. The Holy Father wanted to go there. He wanted to stand there. He spent a full 5-10 minutes in silent prayer in this space. And of course, he brought all the TV cameras with him because he wanted this image to make the rounds of the world as a symbol of his commitment to the pro-life cause. Okay, so I think the only reasonable conclusion is that there will be no retreat and no surrender from the defense of the gospel of life under this Pope. Now, that said, I think there are other elements of Catholic social teaching which he feels have not always gotten the same level of attention, and he wants to lift some of those up. Let me just give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. His first trip outside of Rome was actually not the trip to Brazil. It was earlier in that month, July of 2013. On July 8th, the Pope took a trip to Lampedusa, which is an island in the southern Mediterranean. It's considered part of Sicily in Italy, although it's actually, physically, it's closer to Tunisia than it is to Italy. But in any event, it's considered Italian territory. And it is the primary point of arrival for impoverished migrants and refugees from Africa and the Middle East who are trying to get to Europe. What they will do is they wash up in Lampedusa, and then they try, after they get out of the holding pens there, they try to make their way up to Germany or Belgium or wherever it is they're trying to go. What normally happens to these people is that they spend a year, 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, trying to make their way up the continent to the coast of either Libya or Tunisia. They're usually horribly exploited along the way. Many of them are sold into human slavery and so on. When they get there, whatever meager cash they have in their pockets, they have to fork over to book passage on one of these rickety, overcrowded, unsafe, and illegal boats to try to make their way over the Mediterranean. Over the last 2 decades alone, 20,000 people have died trying to make that crossing. I mean, if you ever need an index of the desperation created by poverty, it is the fact that so many people would knowingly put their lives at risk on the mere chance that they might be able to acquire a better life on the other side of it. So on the 8th of July, the Holy Father went to Lampedusa. He laid a wreath in the sea commemorating the victims. He condemned what he called the globalization of indifference. to the poor and to people on the move. And then he rolled out for the first time what essentially become one of the standard rhetorical tropes of his papacy, which is this contrast he sets up between what he calls a throwaway culture, that is a culture in which whole categories of humanity, the elderly, the unborn, the poor, immigrants, and so on, are considered disposable, as opposed to what he calls a culture of encounter, a culture of welcome, that he believes the world is called to become and that the church is called to model. Okay, so that was the Lampedusa outing. The other striking moment in terms of the Pope's social agenda, I think, came in early September of 2013. If you remember, back in those days, the drums of war were beating in Washington and in London and in Paris. The major Western powers were on the brink of going to war in Syria after reports that the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria had used chemical weapons against his own people. The Pope unleashed a full-court diplomatic press against a widened conflict in Syria. He called all of the ambassadors who are accredited to the Holy See in for a day-long session with his diplomatic brain trust to try to make the case against war. He used every tool in the toolbox. He was speaking about this during his Angelus addresses and during his Wednesday general audiences. He was sending out anti-war tweets. And all of this culminated on the 7th of September 2013, when the Pope asked all 1.2 billion Catholics of the world to join him in a special day of prayer and fasting for peace in Syria, including the Holy Father himself, presiding over a remarkably powerful 5-hour penitential service in St. Peter's Square. And although it's always hard to prove a negative, many secular foreign policy experts, people who are not Catholics and have no reason necessarily to defend the church, will tell you that the Pope's activism was one of the key ingredients in preventing, at that stage, a widening of the Syrian conflict. I mean, no less an authority than Vladimir Putin said that, who is, let's be clear, no best friend, no BFF of the Catholic Church. Okay? Now, my point here is that these early gestures in terms of the Pope's social agenda, what you have is a statement of solidarity with immigrants and with the poor, and an anti-war statement. That's the social gospel in action. I think it is what you will increasingly be seeing and hearing from this Pope, not as an alternative to our pro-life activism, but as an organic complement to it. Okay? That's how he understands mission. Finally, the third pillar of the Francis agenda, mercy as the most important Christian message at this moment in time. Folks, by this stage in my career, I've covered 3 popes. Okay, I covered John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and now Francis. These have all been extraordinarily complex men, and it is impossible to just sort of boil them down into handy-dandy little sound bites. Now, having said that, let me proceed to boil them all down into handy-dandy little sound bites. Because there was, with each of these popes, I think, a kind of signature phrase, okay, that cuts to the heart of what they were about. With John Paul II, I think there's no doubt whatsoever what that signature phrase was. The phrase was, be not afraid. Be not afraid. Okay, the Latin version of which is duc in altum, set out into the deep. This was a brash, bold, confident pope who wanted to revitalize the capacity of the church to be a change agent in the here and now. And of course, he was stunningly successful in that regard. I mean, if you don't believe it, I can introduce you to a lot of former Soviet apparatchiks in Eastern Europe who lost their jobs in 1989, principally due to the role that John Paul played in supporting the Solidarity movement in Poland and setting the dominoes in motion that led to the fall of the Soviet Empire and all of that. Now, with Benedict XVI, again, I don't think there's any serious debate about what that signature phrase was. It was reason and faith. Reason and faith. That was the heart of the argument that Benedict was trying to make to the world over 8 very difficult years. That human reason and religious faith need one another. That faith, shorn of the capacity for critical self-reflection, becomes extremism and fundamentalism. That human reason, shorn of this anchor that religious values provided, becomes skepticism and nihilism. Okay, that to be healthy, these two things need each other. If you'll excuse an egg-headed phrase, they are symbiotically codependent. Okay, that was the argument. Okay? Now, I know it's early in the game with Francis, but I think we already know what his signature phrase is. It is something he repeats over and over and over again. So often it ought to be printed on bumper stickers and T-shirts. Okay? It's sort of the epigrammatic motto of this papacy. And that phrase is, the Lord never tires of forgiving. The Lord never tires of forgiving. And sometimes he adds, it is we who get tired of asking for forgiveness. Fundamentally, it is a message of mercy. Mercy, ladies and gentlemen, is quite literally this Pope's motto. His motto as Pope is the same motto he had as the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, miserando atque elegendo. It's a Latin phrase that comes from a homily of the Venerable Bede on the gospel scene of the Call of Matthew. It's a little hard to translate into English, but I mean, fundamentally what it means is choosing through the eyes of mercy, okay? Making decisions on the basis of mercy. Okay? Mercy is in virtually every talk this Pope gives. I think if you did a textual study of every word that has flowed from his lips since his election more than 18 months ago, you would find that the most common substantive noun he invokes is mercy. It was in his first homily, his first Sunday homily as Pope. He chose to say his first Sunday Mass not in St. Peter's Basilica, where popes normally do it, but in St. Anne's Church, which is the kind of parish church for the worker bees in the Vatican. And on that occasion, he started his homily by saying that I hope the theologians in the room will forgive me, but in my opinion, the strongest message of the Lord is mercy. Okay? Mercy is also in this Pope's deeds. You see it, among other things, in his passion for the sacrament of confession. Okay? Cute story along those lines. Pope, as I'm sure all of you know, is also the Bishop of Rome. Right? He's also the leader of the local diocese in Rome. And one of the things that popes try to do to do justice to that role is they try to get around and make parish visits in Rome. Okay? Francis so far has been to 7 parishes in Rome. His first visit came on May 21st, 2013, when he went to the parish of Saints Elizabeth and Zechariah, which is in the Porta Pia neighborhood up in the north of Rome. It's about 30 miles from the city center, kind of a working class neighborhood. The Pope was supposed to get there at 10:30 in the morning. Okay? Now the pastor there is a Romanian immigrant by the name of Father Beoni Ambris. At around 9:40 or so, Father Beoni starts picking up in his ears the rotor wash of a helicopter, right? And he thinks at first, well, this is the Carabinieri, right? The Italian security guys who are doing a flyover. But then the thump, thump, thump gets closer and it gets louder. And eventually he realizes, oh my God, this is the papal helicopter. Okay? So after they get the defibrillator and restart Father's heart, he runs out to the parking lot where they've set up this impromptu helipad, right? Francis gets there 45 minutes early. He pops out of the helicopter and he says, look, I'm really sorry for the early start. But in addition to meeting with the kids and saying Mass and all of that, I would also really like to hear some confessions. Now you have to understand, this was not part of the program, okay? So Father Beoni runs and grabs 8 people basically at random and says to them, you're going to confession. He told me the story later. They looked up at him and said, well, Father, that's very sweet, but we don't want to lose our spot in line to see the Pope. And he said, oh, trust me, you're going to see the Pope. And then he brings them into the church, lines them up in front of the confessionals. You know, one by one, Francis sits there, hears their sins, and administers God's forgiveness. Now, in part, this was just him trying to be a good Bishop of Rome, but in part, it was important to him that the world see the Holy Father make a point of administering the Church's premier rite of mercy. Okay? This is a Pope, folks, who has described his entire papacy as a kairos of mercy. A kairos, using that evocative Greek New Testament term that means a privileged moment in God's plan of salvation. That's how he sees what he's trying to accomplish. I am profoundly convinced that everything Francis is doing, from the nitty-gritty details of how do we restructure the Vatican Bank, on up to what do we do about communion for divorced and remarried Catholics and beyond, I mean, all of it, fundamentally, is predicated on the desire that when the outside world looks at the Catholic Church, what they will see is a community of mercy. Community that doesn't only pay lip service to mercy, but actually practices it in terms of its internal life. Now look, Francis is no naïf. Okay? He understands that as a minister of the Christian gospel, he is obligated to do two things with regard to a fallen world. He has to pronounce both God's judgment and God's mercy. Okay? One without the other would be a falsification of the Christian message. But I think his calculation is that the world has heard our judgment quite clearly. And now it is time for the world to see and to hear and to feel and to smell and to taste our mercy. In my business, the media business, we have come up with all kinds of cute little monikers for Francis. We talk about him as the People's Pope and the Pope of the Poor and the Maverick Pope. And all of these things capture something. But if you want my prediction, and by the way, I'm aware that no one here has asked for it, but I am legendary for answering questions I've never been asked, okay? So here it is. My prediction is that when the last word is written about this papacy, Francis will be remembered as the Pope of Mercy. Pope of Mercy. That is his spiritual Rosetta Stone. If you understand his commitment to that virtue, then you will understand a great deal about his papacy and his agenda. All right? Finally, a couple of quick thoughts about the recently concluded Synod of Bishops. First of all, let me tell you that I have been covering the Catholic Church man and boy for 20 years. I kind of thought I had seen absolutely everything. Nothing in my professional experience prepared me for the drama of those 2 weeks in Rome. In fact, in my column last week, I actually awarded the Oscars from the 2014 Synod, precisely because whatever else you want to say about it, it was one heck of a show. Okay? It was tremendous drama. Two quick thoughts. One is I think we have to be grateful to the Synod because what it has done, and bear in mind, Francis conceived this originally as merely a point of departure, not a point of arrival. This is a first Synod of Bishops on the family, which is now supposed to lead into a year-long process of reflection, which will then culminate in another larger Synod of Bishops next October in Rome. I think what we have to be grateful to the Synod for is that what it has done is it has brought into clear relief where the fault lines really are in the Church with regard to issues pertaining to the family and to sexual morality. And basically speaking, on the back of the Synod, I think we can say there are three clearly defined fault lines that kind of dominated discussion there and are likely to dominate discussion over the next year. So one is homosexuality. Okay? No question, obviously, of changing church teaching on marriage, and therefore no question of giving approval of any sort to same-sex unions. But the question is, what kind of language do we use to talk about people who are in same-sex unions? Can we find a more affirmative language? And can we create space to welcome people into the faith community who are in these relationships? Or does doing so risk blurring the consistency and the clarity of our witness to the defense of marriage as a lifetime union between a man and a woman that is open to new life? Okay? That's one fault line. Second fault line. What about all kinds of other relationships that are out there? Couples who are living together outside of marriage. Couples who are divorced and remarried civilly without going through the church process for an annulment, and all kinds of other kind of lifestyle choices that are out there. Can we recognize that should we recognize that even though these relationships fall short of the ideal that the Church proposes for marriage, nevertheless they may contain some value? Some of the bishops at the Synod wanted to make an analogy with the teaching of the Second Vatican Council on other Christian churches and other religions. As you know, the teaching of the Council was that the full truth about the community Christ wanted to call into being subsists exclusively in the Catholic Church. However, there are what the Council called seeds of the Word, that is, elements of truth and holiness in other Christian denominations and in other religions, which we can affirm and embrace. And by way of analogy, some of the bishops of the Synod were saying that a couple living together outside of marriage, look, that's not the full truth of Christ's plan for married life. But there nevertheless may be elements of truth and holiness in that relationship. If it's a relationship marked by fidelity, by mutual support, by sacrifice, and so on, that those are positive elements that we could acknowledge. And again, the other side of that argument would be, do we risk saying that if we say that there are positive elements in all these other relationships, does that really amount to not only fuzzing our teaching about marriage, but also doing an injustice to all of those people out there who were striving heroically to live their marriages the way the church says they ought to be lived? Does that, in essence, do an injustice to those folks? Okay, so that's a second fault line. And then the third fault line would clearly be over the issue of whether divorced and civilly remarried Catholics, that is, Catholics who have divorced and then gotten remarried outside the church, whether on some limited basis, at least some of those folks ought to be allowed to receive the sacraments of communion and confession. As you know, of course, under the Church's current discipline, that's impossible. There clearly was one very strong camp at the Synod in favor of such a move, seeing it as a kind of act of mercy, a pastoral accommodation. And another camp that said that, first of all, that's illogical because we teach that marriage is for life, and therefore we can't possibly sanction a second marriage. And further, that this is exactly at a time when marriage is under assault in so many ways in the culture, this is exactly the wrong time to be going soft. Okay? That's a third fault line. And I think the gift of the Synod was that it sort of increased the focus on those three issues and gave us all a kind of sense of what the conversation over the next year and at the next Synod is likely to be about. That's the positive thing from the Synod. The negative thing, I would say, is that, you know, at the very beginning, the Pope said to the bishops, I want you to speak boldly and listen humbly. Okay? I would say they got the speaking boldly part right. I'm not sure how much humble listening was actually going on. I mean, the debate was robust, and at times it was inspired and remarkable, but there was also a kind of nasty undercurrent to it, both on the inside and on the outside. I mean, on one side, there were accusations that the Pope was stacking the deck to produce a certain conclusion from the Synod, that the machinery was systematically stifling dissenting voices. And, you know, on the other side, you know, people were talking about a lack of nerve and a failure in courage, and there was some finger pointing and stuff that was going on. This was happening to some extent inside the Synod Hall. To a much greater extent, it was happening everywhere else, you know, particularly in the Catholic blogosphere and in the media and all of this kind of stuff. And so I think the real gut check we face over the next year is, can we have an adult conversation about these issues that ends in a kind of way to summon the best of all of these points of view, rather than ending up more badly divided than we began. Okay? And if you'll bear with me, just to drive that point home, and I promise you this is the last thing I'm going to do, I want to tell you one last story to illustrate the danger that we face over the next year. I think it was mentioned during the introduction, I hail from rural western Kansas. Now, I have no idea if anyone in this room has ever been to rural western Kansas. Frankly, I could think of no reason on God's earth why you should have been. Okay? My folks come from a small western Kansas hamlet called Hill City. It is my candidate for the worst place name in America because there is no hill and there sure as hell is no city. Okay? Talking like 400 people on a good day. Now, as a result, we are not exactly a thriving crossroads of the tourist industry, okay? I mean, usually the only time of year we get any out-of-town visitors at all is right now. It's the fall because this is pheasant hunting season. You know what a pheasant is? It's a little kind of game bird, sort of like a turkey. There's a certain kind of guy, and they are almost always guys, who finds the idea of smearing, you know, combat paint on their face and putting on fatigues and then blasting shotguns in the sky over the course of a weekend to be a real hoot. Now, generally, this is done while consuming astronomical quantities of beer. So they are almost always a greater threat to one another than they are to the pheasant population. But nevertheless, they come. Hill City has one more, just to illustrate to you the cultural milieu I'm talking about, Hill City has one motel. It is a place called the Western Hills Motel, 11 rooms. And ladies and gentlemen, I have stayed in some pretty funky lodgings on every continent on this planet of ours. The Western Hills Motel in Hill City is the only place I have ever stayed where there is a laminated sign in the bathroom that reads, "Please do not gut your birds in the sink." The first time I took my wife there, she looked at me and said, "Is this some kind of weird sexual double entendre?" And I had to explain, "No, honey, this is face value stuff." Okay, they mean it. All right, this story is set on one weekend during pheasant hunting season. We've got an out-of-town guy, let's call him a lawyer from New York, who has come out to Graham County, Kansas to try to bag himself a bird. He spent a long and frustrating weekend with no luck. Okay, now it's like, early Sunday afternoon. He's got to get in his rental car to drive the 400 miles to either Kansas City or Denver to catch his flight to LaGuardia. Before he leaves, he decides he's going to take one last shot. So he sees a pheasant moving across the skyline. He shoulders his weapon, fires, and miracle of miracles, he brings down the bird. Okay, and so now flush with triumph, he sets across the field to pick up his trophy. Just as he gets to the spot where the bird has fallen, he comes across a barbed wire fence that clearly says, "Private property, keep out." Okay? But he has invested way too much blood, tears, toil, and sweat at this stage, so he starts to climb over the fence. And as he does so, the Western Kansas farmer pulls up in his tractor and says, "Hey, buddy, what are you doing?" And the guy says, "Well, that's my pheasant. I'm going to pick it up." And the farmer says, "Oh, no, you're not. That bird landed on my property. It belongs to me." Okay? Now, the lawyer, you have to understand, is like hot, and he's frustrated, and he's in a hurry, so he just erupts. He says, "You don't get it. I am a senior partner in a top 10 law firm in New York, and if you don't let me have that bird, I'm going to sue you back to the Stone Age." Okay. Not understanding this is pretty much where the farmer already lives. Okay. Yeah, I know, ouch, but I grew up there. I can say this stuff. It's okay. Anyway, the farmer looks at him and says, "Well, that may be how you do things where you come from. But around here, we've got something called the 3-kick rule." Lawyer says, "3-kick rule? What's that about?" Farmer says, "Well, it's very simple. I kick you 3 times, then you kick me 3 times. We keep going. Eventually, whoever gives up loses the bird." Okay? And the lawyer thinks, well, it's probably cheaper than a lawsuit. Anyway, this guy looks like he's 112 years old. I can probably take him. Says, all right. So they square up against one another. Farmer looks at the lawyer and says, "Are you ready?" The lawyer says, "Ready as I'm going to get." Now you have to understand the farmer is wearing these heavy mud-clawed Western Kansas work boots, right? So he gives him one shot in the shins. He screams in pain. Gives him another shot in the midsection. This time his howls of agony can be heard to the Nebraska border. Okay? And I can tell most of you do not know your Western Kansas geography because this is a fair stretch from where I'm talking about. All right? Gives the guy one last shot under the chin, right? This time he's barely conscious, he's seeing stars, but finally, with his last best ounce of effort, the lawyer staggers to his feet, he dusts himself off, he puts this look of grim determination on his face, stares the farmer dead in the eyes and says, "All right, Yield Coot, now it's my turn." And the farmer looks at him and smiles and says, "That's all right, I give up. You can have the bird." This is how we roll, Western Kansas style. Ladies and gentlemen, I would submit to you that the central risk we face over the next 12 months is that this constructive, productive, adult conversation that the Holy Father has tried to launch about some extremely sensitive and pastorally critical issues in the life of the church, the risk is it could boil down to an ecclesiastical version of the 3-kick rule, where we're not actually looking to find common ground or to reach a shared understanding. What we're really doing is looking to take rhetorical cheap shots against people we perceive to be our political and theological enemies. Now, that way of doing business under any set of circumstances would be ugly. It would be aesthetically repugnant. And those of you who know your von Balthasar know that there's a theological insight there, right? If something is distant from beauty, it is probably also distant from truth. Under any set of circumstances, this kind of tribal war of all against all would also be impossible to reconcile with the ecclesiology of communion to which John Paul called us, Benedict called us, and now Francis is calling us. But in these particular circumstances, in a media-saturated environment in the early 21st century, where accusations and conspiracy theories go viral like that, okay, and in an environment in which people bring great passion to these conversations, and therefore their emotions are already a bit raw and on edge, I think we're going to have to work especially hard over the next 12 months to try to see one another, particularly those people with whom we may disagree in the church, to see them with a hermeneutic of generosity rather than a hermeneutic of suspicion. If we can do that, then the synodal journey upon which the Holy Father has launched us, I think, will take us someplace good. Okay, that's what I've got. Thank you. God bless you. God bless St. Mary's Seminary. And ladies and gentlemen, viva il Papa!
Thank you very much. I felt like I was just being taken away with your passion, with your wisdom, with all that good stuff. Now, we have a goodly opportunity for questions. We have lots of things we can talk about. But here are a few ground rules. First of all, there are 2 microphones. I have been told to tell you to please go to those microphones and speak into them so everybody can hear, and we're being recorded, and that'll be all continued. The second thought that I would have is please sort of focus your questions, think about what you want to ask, so we can get to the answers, which are much more fun. So I invite you to please consider any good questions. Please get up and go to the microphone.
While you're doing that, can I just sort of prime the pump by giving you both an invitation and a warning? The invitation is you are obviously welcome to ask anything about the presentation you just heard, but don't feel limited to that. I mean, you know, anything that you want to talk about, this is your dime, it's your conversation. I may not know the answer to your question, but folks, I spend a lot of my time working in American TV where absolute ignorance is never a bar to talking about anything. And I see no reason why it should be here tonight. Now, the warning is the good people at St. Mary's are paying me to stand here for the next 20 minutes or so, whether you have questions or not. So if you don't come up with questions, I am simply going to tell you more Pope jokes. And I promise you, this is not a consummation devoutly to be wished. You don't believe me? Okay, here we go. Pope walks into a bar with a frog on his shoulder. Bartender looks up and says, "Hey, that's kind of cool. Where'd you get it?" And the frog says, "Buenos Aires." Not a road we want to go down.
So, sir, if you get close to the microphone, please.
Yes, I'm Jack Kehoe, and if the audience wants, I'll sit down and he can tell jokes.
I guarantee you they'd rather hear from you.
You know, one of the striking things about Pope Francis to me is the depth of his conversation when it seems to be off the cuff. I mean, just insights just pour out of his homilies, his comments. Just a phrase like, "Are we a